everyone, it's Jan with What You Make It, and I'm here to show you how we made this cute little button tree. I started out with a stamp and die set from Paper Tray Ink called Buttoned Up and Button Bits, I think, and it has two dies, one that has a scallop edge and one that has a smooth edge. And I originally thought I would do some stamping, but I ended up going a different direction. But if you don't have these dies, you could use real buttons. Or you could also use some hole punches to create this same kind of effect. I am going to tell you again that I think you will want to use watercolor paper because this is very similar to the poinsettia technique that I did. But if you were using a hole punch, just use your paper piercer and put two holes together or a small hole punch, and then take whatever size of hole punch, whether it's a 1/2 inch or 5/8 or whatever you decide that you need. But the process is basically the same. Now I'm going to show you how I reviewed that we used the staining technique with distress ink on these. I failed to get a recording of me actually staining the buttons, but this is the way you do it. You just put your light color, add some dark color of distress ink to them, and then you put them inside of an embossing folder. And I used this basic gray plaid folder, and you can see here that you get just a nice texture on there. And we want to add just a little bit more dark ink, so I'm using Forest Moss and just working my way through them. When I have them all done, I moved on to the next step, which is taking the Distress Rock Candy Crackle Paint and putting that rather heavily on, and then sprinkling some clear Distress vintage glitter on it. You'll want to have a little piercing tool to clean out the buttonholes when you're done. Trust me, I forgot on a couple of them, and I learned the hard way. So just put a good coating of the Distress Crackle on, load up, and sprinkle from a little bit of a height your clear glitter, and then set them aside to dry, and you'll be ready for the next step. With our buttons done, it's time to start working on our background, and I'm using one of Tim Holt's embossing folders that has that kind of blank area in the center, and I'm starting with Antique Linen Distress Ink, and I'm just bringing in color from the side. I'm going all the way in. The cardstock I used was very heavy, but it was bright white, and I like the heaviness of it because you get a great impression, but I thought for our rustic tree we needed to have a little bit more of an off-white or vintagey looking. So I'm kind of working on creating the look of a vintage wanted poster, the background of that. And you'll notice that somewhere in making the buttons I'd gotten a little bit of green on my background. You know what? Let's go with it. I actually put a little re-inker out, made some water, thought, you know, a wanted poster would probably be stained with all kinds of things. So instead of being worried about that particular stain, I'm actually going to make it work for me. And I'm bringing just a little bit of that green into the rest of the poster. Just making touches of it here and there, and then going back and building up on it. At first I made it very light, and then I realized I needed to actually add more of the re-inker in to make those splotches show up. Now when I go back and add the next layer of color over it, it's not going to be so noticeable. So I got the walnut distress stain out, and walnut stain ink, and I'm using my ink blending tool, and now I'm darkening the edges. I'm really wanting the edges to be dark, and I'm going to want to bring out that pattern by going in with the ink pad and actually touching those top spots. Now it gets a little messy. You'll notice that there are some actual corners of my ink pad that have shown up on the inside. Again, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to make it work for me. I take a paintbrush and some water, and I'm just softening them because distress ink reacts with water. I can almost make it look like it was intentional. And you notice I go in and I add a few more marks because I really do want it to look like it's been around forever and was just something that, I don't want it too perfect. And, if I had to start over every time I made a mess, I would never have one of these videos done. So I just try and make my messes work for me. So I hope you'll be encouraged to do that too. So when I finished all of this, I wanted to dry it really, really, really well. And then I was going to just add a little bit more visual texture by stamping some pine cones or some pine boughs into the background. And I'm using antique linen ink again over the antique linen that we did. So it's very subtle, but it will, again, it just adds a little visual interest, and I like how it turned out. And once I had all of that done, I needed to trim down the background so that it would show up on the card front. I wanted it to be slightly smaller, so I trimmed that down and roughed up the edges. And when you rough up the edges, you begin to see the white again of the paper. So I once that was done, I had to go back in and add some more distress stain to it. Just keep working with it till you get what you like. Now it's time to make the button tree, and I will tell you that either I am old or my eyes are failing me. So I decided not to fuss with and struggle with putting twine through the buttons. I ended up making my own little needle out of some small gauge wire, and I'm using the twine. And this is why I ended up being really glad that I used paper buttons instead of real buttons, because they're thin enough that when I string them together, and basically I'm building a layer of the tree at the time, they're thin enough that I can kind of let them overlap so that they fill the area that I want. To finish it and put it onto the card, I put some dimensionals, and you'll notice that I cut a little bit longer tail of the thread as I was doing that, and just tucking it back on itself. And that gives some additional stability, and you don't have to tie off the twine. Once that's done, you can just put them in place, and your tree is on its way to being built. You can see I just did the same thing, just a layer at the time. Because I had the scalloped buttons and the smooth buttons, I kind of alternated between the two, just again for a little bit more visual interest. Last one on the top. And then for the star, I used a wooden veneer by Studio Calico. I stamped my sentiment from Peaceful Pine Cones. Part of it is in red brick or aged mahogany, and I thought it was a nice touch to add one of those pine boughs back behind it as well that we had used on the front. I popped it up on some dimensionals, and the card was done. Really, today's technique was about remembering that we had learned a new technique with the poinsettias and bringing it forward on another project. And I hope that you'll do that. When you find something that works for you, I hope you'll try it on a second project. You all take care. I'll be back soon with another tutorial. Merry Christmas and God bless.